Alright, hey everyone, welcome back to another video of Salesforce Makes Sense. This is Imanshu and we are continuing our journey of becoming Salesforce developers through this Apex Masterclass, right? So in the last video, we probably understood custom metadata, custom settings and custom labels, and now we'll jump into understanding errors and exceptions, right? Not every code is picture perfect, not every code is 100% perfect, right? And to reach that stage, you need to go through iterations of failures, iteration of errors, iteration of exceptions. So is that wrong? It's not. First of all, it's always good to make errors, but it's not good to repeat those errors. It's always good to make the errors once, learn from it, and then move ahead, right? So even that even then if you have done all your checks, if you have done everything perfectly on sandboxes and you have written your code which you think is error free, there are chances that things might fail in a live system when actually business or customers are using your code, right? So when they're using it, there might be certain scenarios, certain use cases that you might not have considered about, and they are failing, right? So specifically those kind of issues, you have to ensure that you handle them, and you have to ensure you handle them at your best capacity based on what you know. And that's where errors and exception handling comes into the picture, right? And that's the primary idea of our current tutorial, this particular topic today. We'll look at a variety of exceptions and we'll also understand how to handle them, okay, in terms of the practice. So what are exceptions? Exceptions are errors that disrupt the flow of code execution. Now anything that does not let your code execute the way it is supposed to execute is an exception, right? So to gracefully handle exceptions, we use something called as try catch blocks. Okay, we'll talk about it. For those of you who have a Java background or maybe C background, I don't know, C++ or C#, or maybe even Python, I am not sure, you would understand try catch blocks. But for those of you who do not know what these blocks are, we'll look into it. Okay, now whenever an exception occurs, execution kind of halts, meaning it does not let the code proceed to the very next line also. It stops there and it tries to do a rollback, meaning if you are trying to, go somewhere, right? And your ideal goal is to reach the destination. But if your vehicle breaks down in between, right, what do? You cannot go ahead, right? Your execution or your movement halts, right? And then what do? You roll back yourself to probably a service center or probably back home, because you cannot travel, right? And once you are ready, only then you can travel again, right? So the idea with exceptions is the same. If there's an exception in the system and it is not handled properly, the execution will halt, and anything that has been done on the database as part of this transaction, right, will be rolled back, meaning the changes will not be shown on the database, or the changes will not reflect, they will be taken back. All right, that's the idea. Now these exceptions are captured in debug logs. You remember we understood and mastered debug logs to a certain extent. Yes, so you can see the exceptions and errors there. Okay, and if it is not handled, if the exceptions are not handled, sometimes you even receive an email with the error message. Now this exception occurred, please take a look at this particular record. The flow tried to update these records, but this particular action failed. This process builder failed due to this reason. So those kind of emails are sent to the person who last modified that particular process or code. Okay, and the exception or the error is also shown on the UI to the customer. So if the customer is using a system and as part of that usage, maybe you are doing 10 things in the background. Let's say you are doing a case update, you are also sending out an email, then you are also updating the case team members, and you are syncing it with one more custom object. One of these items fails. What happens? None of the items will be processed. Everything will be rolled back and the customer will see an error on the screen. Something went wrong, exception occurred, or some kind of red color message or a toast message will show up, okay, which is not ideal for end user experience. Okay, so anything that you do in the background, you have to ensure that you handle the exceptions properly. And that's what we are going to do as part of this tutorial, and we'll understand what kind of exceptions can generally occur and how to really handle them, and what is the best way to actually deal with them. All right, so we'll talk about exception types, and this is not going to be a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation where I take you through each one of them. That's it. No, we'll actually try to break the system, and we'll try to see when these exceptions come so that we are smart enough to handle them. Okay, that's the idea. So I've listed some of them, some of the very common ones. The first one being my favorite, the null pointer exception. The second one is SObject exception. So null pointer exception is basically, okay, let's not go into the details. We'll try to see it in the system live. Second one is an SObject exception. then you have QueryException, then you have DmlException, you have LimitException, you have something called mixed DML, and then you have the parent class of all exceptions, that's called exception. Meaning in Salesforce there's a class called exception, so that's a class in Salesforce. All right, and even these are classes in Salesforce, each one of them, and that's how Salesforce throws this particular class variable to you, and then you get this errors. All right, so if there's a class, then there's definitely going to be methods. So you have 4 methods available: the get message, the get cause, the get line number, and get stack trace string. So what is get message? It basically tells you this error has occurred, like it gives you a description about what is the error message that the system has thrown. Get cause tells you from where is this error originating. The line number, meaning the line number where the code broke, line number 215. So that 215 line will basically be printed as part of this method. And stack trace is a very important identifier to understand how the flow ran and how did the exception occurred and what is the trace. How do you trace it back to the source call? Meaning, let's say you have a flow that's updating the records. That flow in turn, because it is updating a record, it is calling the after update trigger. When the after update trigger is called, you are calling a case trigger handler. In the case trigger handler, you are actually doing an email. That email is failing for one of the recipients. So this trace of from where things started and where did it reach and where did it actually fail, from which line number to which line number, that stack trace information is sent or is given to us by this particular method. Very important and very useful method. Okay, so these are the exception methods. Now, how do you really handle exceptions? If you do not handle them, if they are left unhandled, your system will break. Correct, but you don't want that to happen. Meaning system will break as in the customer will receive the error message, but you don't want the customer to see anything negative, anything wrong, you don't want to disrupt the flow of the customer, right? So you need to ensure that you are handling them properly. Now when I say handling them, you need to ensure that you are using something called the try catch blocks. Okay, so try catch block. Now there are 3 or 4 keywords here: try, catch, finally, blocks. First of all, what is a block? We understood this in the basics, right? In the OOPS concepts and the object concept, a block is nothing but a series of statements, right? A set of statements configures a block, and blocks are normally within the curly braces. Remember, right? Now that is the first keyword that we understood. Now you have 3 more keywords: try, catch, and finally. So the name is pretty much explanatory, but I'll give you a hint, right? So try. What will we do? We'll basically use a try block, we'll use a catch block, and we'll use a finally block, right? So we'll say, I want to do these 5 operations. Can you try it? So I'll put those 5 operations within the try block. Okay. I'll say when you're trying it, if you're able to find any exception as any one of those lines fails to execute or some error comes, can you please catch that exception so that it does not go to the end user? Can you catch it? Meaning the system can catch it. So we'll catch the exception here and handle our system accordingly. What we need to do based on whenever an error occurs, we probably want to log it in the system. Maybe we want to notify the owner of the org that some error has occurred, but no disruptive experience on the customer side. So we'll catch it from the database side, from the backend side, and we'll try to handle it ourselves. And once this is done and this is done, is there anything I want to do? Finally, let's do that. So that's the whole understanding of try, catch, finally blocks. Okay. Now see, when will exceptions come? When you will actually try something, right? When will you really fail? When you actually try doing something, right? You cannot just fail because you are not doing anything. You will fail when you actually try to attempt something new. So you always will fail, meaning you will always catch something when you try something. Is that true? It's true, right? So with the try block, you either need to have the catch block or you need to have the finally block. All right. So the try block is the first mandatory, but you can either have the catch block or you can have the finally block. If you don't have any one of them, it will throw an error. Okay. Now, when you're trying out something, it's not necessary that there could be just one failure. You could have 5 failures, right? You want to start running, right? And then your shoes are, not the appropriate shoes. So you need good running shoes. But when you got the running shoes, you started running and then you twisted your feet. So then that's another problem. Then you have to go for therapy. And then when you went for therapy, you could not really get therapy because slots were not available. So multiple failures occurred, right? But then you tried to run. Correct. So one try can have multiple catch blocks. So there could be multiple failures, obviously different kind of failures in a single try block. So whatever you want to catch, you can catch by putting multiple catch blocks, right? But then again, what do you want to do finally at the end? Do you still want to go ahead and try running again? Yes or no? That's the final decision, right? So there will always be one finally block. It cannot be multiple finally blocks that you will say, yeah, I want to run also, I don't want to run also. That's null, that's a void statement, right? So you should only have one finally block. So I hope these two lines are clear. Okay, interview questions come around this, that, you know, can you write the syntax for try, catch, finally block? How many catch blocks can you write? What if I write 3 catch blocks and 1 finally statement? What if I don't write catch and finally? Can I just write catch and finally? All of these combinations, I hope now you are clear. Okay, awesome. Now that we have done our theoretical part, it's time to actually jump into understanding these methods, understanding how to write the try, catch, finally blocks, and also seeing each of these exceptions, right? Whatever we can. Awesome. Let's go to VS Code, and I'll just go ahead and create a new class, and this class is going to be my exceptions, or let's just call it exceptional exceptions. All right. And those of you who agree with me that, you know, failures are okay, it's okay to make mistakes. See, there are two different things. It's okay to make mistakes. It's not okay to make, it's not okay to repeat mistakes, right? So just give me a comment below, or probably just tell me that what do you guys think, is making mistakes okay? Because the environment that we live in does not let you make mistakes. But that's not true, right? How would you actually proceed in life if you don't make mistakes? And when you make mistakes, that's when you do the maximum learning very fast, right? You don't have to be picture perfect, and, you know, you don't have to be 100% perfect all the time. It's not a movie of Amir Khan, right? It's basically actual life, and when you're dealing with certain things, failures will occur, and they'll teach you something, and when then you learn it, you don't make that same mistake again, and that's how you actually grow in life, right? Just tell me if you guys are also in a situation where mistakes and failures are not allowed. But I think it should be okay. You don't need to bother about the society, and you are free to make mistakes until and unless you don't repeat them. Okay, cool. Enough of philosophy. Now let's go back to Salesforce. Exceptional exceptions is our class, and I am going to create a method. So I'll just say public static void handle my first exception. Okay, let's try to figure out use cases, because I need to explain you each of this type. So we'll not do something that's already planned. We'll try to figure it out on the way as we do the tutorial. Okay, so first things first, I want to actually look at a null pointer exception, right? So what is a null pointer exception? Anything like, for example, if you say decimal, or let's go with a string one, like string my name, right? Now what is my name? My name is a variable. What data type does it hold? It is a string data type. Is there a memory allocated to it in the heap space? Yes, it is allocated. But what is stored as a value to this right now? Nothing. It's null. We understood the null keyword in one of our previous statements, right? So it's currently null. If you try to debug and print it, it will basically tell you null. Okay, let's quickly look at things, and I'll just go ahead and say deploy. And I want to actually print out what's the value. Okay, so this is created in Salesforce, and let's go back to Salesforce. I'll open the dev console. This opens up on a new tab, copy website address, close, duplicate, and then open it here. All right, now that I've opened it here, let's go back to VS Code, and I want to actually call my Apex class from the anonymous window. So I'll say exceptional exceptions dot handle my first exception, right? Let's see what does this method do. Okay, let's see how does it behave right now. Okay, be very cautious of how the method is behaving. I'll just say open log and say execute. All right, so it executed fine, and if I take a look at the debug only logs, it says that the value is null, right? Now the value is null. If I say if my name is not equal to Himanshu system dot, I'll just say system dot debug, it's not a name. All right, let's just go ahead and put a debug log. All right, I'll get rid of this debug log, and now what I'm trying to do is I've just put a conditional operator. Let's try to deploy this, and let's go back, and I'll just go ahead and say re-execute my previous log. Where do I do it? I'll simply say execute last. All right, executed fine. Let's open the content, and if you take a look at the logs, right, so you see the status shows success here. If I say debug only, it is saying it's not a name. All right, so the value is null, correct? the value is currently null and you're trying to access it, but it's not equal to it. So it's just printing this name. Awesome. All right. So even if we did not declare it as null specifically, it is holding a value that's called null, right? Now, when does a null pointer exception come? If I were to do something like this, if I say list of string, or let's do a query, right? I'll say account info is equal to select id comma name from account where name is equal to S. Salesforce makes sense a lot, right? And I want to basically say I want to just get the first record. According to my understanding, there is a record that exists in the system with this name, okay? And I directly want to actually access this. So I'll just say system.debug. I want to display what is the account info variable that is of the account type. Okay, looks good, right? It's not a problem. But now if I deploy it, let's see what happens. It's a simple thing. I'm trying to query and then I'm trying to assign it to a variable, and when I assign it to a variable, I'm trying to just access the value. So you see what's happened? It says it's throwing an error right now. It says list has no rows for assignment to SObject, but what is the type of error? It is saying it is a query exception. Okay, so that's how you see an exception. Perfect. Now let's try to look at an exception wherein you'd want to see that, okay, this is a null exception, right? So let's say that I want to actually query a record that actually exists in the system. Let's try to do that. I'll say select id comma name from account, and let's even print, let's say, the rating industry. Okay, let's try this out. So what do I have? I have S4, right? Okay, let's take this one, my company name, my account name. Okay, so now we'll say when name is equal to Salesforce makes sense. All right, and now this should return a record. This should return a record. I'll just say select id comma name comma industry comma rating. Perfect. Now it should return a record and I'll see a record getting returned. Let's say deploy. Okay, I'll get rid of this log, this log, this log, and now I'll just re-execute my previous anonymous code. Execute last. Executes fine, no query exception now. And now if you see, if I take a look at the debug only statement, it gives me the information about the ID and the name. Perfect. All right, now what I want to do, I want to actually print what is the rating of my company. Because I have received an account info record, right? I want to print the rating information from the SOQL query by using a dot operator. Very simple thing that we usually do, right? Now let's go ahead and try to deploy it. Okay, now if I deploy it and if I try to execute my last code, let's see what happens. Executed fine, and if I say debug only, it shows null. Right? So you see, null is coming up automatically when the system is trying to access any variable or anything that does not have a value assigned to it. All right, so now what I want to do is I want to basically try to access, or let's say access, any kind of information from an instance that does not really have it. So I want to see a null pointer exception showing up on my window, right? So if I go ahead and say account info 2, right? I've created an instance variable, and now what I want to do is I want to simply print the rating of this particular record. I don't want the one that's queried, it contains this value, but I want to access a variable that has not been actually initialized, or nothing has been defined here, right, for this particular variable, and I'm trying to access a attribute of using that instance variable. Let's go ahead and say deploy, and let's take a look at execute the last statement. So you see, it says attempt to dereference a null object, and the exception that has shown up is system.NullPointerException. If you take a look at the logs, the status shows attempt to dereference a null object, and this is a null pointer exception. Okay, I want to show you one or two more examples before starting to handling it, right? For example, I want to let's say define a list of account, right? My account list, and I want to initialize it to null, right? For example, it is initialized as null. I know no one does it, but it is initialized as null, right? And now if I want to print system.debug my account list.size, okay, simple thing, list method to print the size. all right? But my instance variable that's created is not given any space in the heap. It is just initialized as null. What happens when we do this? We basically say execute, you get a null pointer exception. All right, why? Because dot size is trying to operate on a variable that's basically null, right? So how is this evaluated? This is evaluated as null dot size. What is null dot size? It will be null. So attempt to dereference a null object. So the object is basically null, and you're trying to attempt to dereference, or open it up and give more information, but you don't have anything there. It's a null thing, so it's giving a null pointer exception. So let's do another example, right? Let's not stop here. Let's see one more example. So for example, I create a map variable, right? Let's say map of id comma account mapping is equal to new map of id comma account, right? Now what do you want to do? You want to basically extract this information based on the ID, which is the key, right? So if I say account mapping dot get, and I use, let's say, some ID, I'll just pick some ID from Salesforce. Let's go to query editor, and let's say execute. I'll pick this ID from here, and let's say I want to access this record, right? And now I'm saying account ACC is equal to account mapping dot get this particular ID. And now what I want to do, I want to basically print ACC dot name. All right. Now, do you think this particular account exists in this map? It does not, first of all, because I have not actually put that value. So I'm initializing the map. I'm trying to access a key that does not exist. So this account ACC should come up as null. And then I'm trying to actually access a value or a metadata attribute of that instance variable, which is null. So null dot name will give me a dereference null object error, which is nothing but a null pointer exception. Okay, let's give it a try. Let's say deploy, and let's try to execute last, and this throws you an error. Let's take a look at the logs. It did throw an error, right? Where is the error? Let's run it again, execute. Yeah, it shows up now. So this is the error, right? So your error is basically nothing but the null pointer exception. So I hope you understood that when you try to access something of a null object or a null reference, and you try to exploit that variable to access some more information from it using the dot operator or some other way, that's where it fails, and that's where it gives you the null pointer exception. So ensure that you work with null pointers carefully, and you always put checks wherever required. Okay. One more example. Okay, one more example. Let's say you have a wrapper created, public class my, let's say, contact wrapper. Okay, and you have a public contact coninfo variable created, which is of type contact. Correct. Now, if you are trying to access, I'll just show you. If you are trying to access something like system.debug, let me initialize the contact wrapper. My contact wrapper is equal to new my contact wrapper, right? Now system.debug wrapper dot coninfo dot first name. Let me do this. Maybe it's able to understand that, but if I were to do something like this, contact con is equal to wrapper dot coninfo, correct? And then if I try to access con dot first name, it should fail. Okay, let's try to deploy this. I have assigned the coninfo value from the wrapper to a contact object, and this is not bulkified, and it is a plain reference. And now we are trying to access a variable from that reference, and it should ideally fail. Okay, so let's go ahead and say debug, execute last, and this time it fails. Okay, and if I take a look at this log, I'll see that line number 16 is failing, right? Line number 16. So where do I see it? I can actually see attempt to dereference, right? See line number 16, system.NullPointerException. All right. So these are null pointer exceptions that show up. Now, how do you really handle them? So let's say this is all the code that you're wanting to write. This is use case 1 that you're doing. This is function 2. This is function 3. And this is function 4. Now, how do you take care of all the errors that are coming here? You use something that's called a try catch block. So what are you really trying to do? You're trying to do all of this. So the try block should basically cover this entire code section. So from here until here is basically your try block. Cool. After the try block, what did we learn? We either should have a catch block or multiple catch blocks or one finally block, correct? So I can say catch. Now catch needs a parameter, and that parameter is of type exception, exception E, that is your variable value, the instance variable of type exception. Now can you put null pointer exception here? Yes, you can create, you can call it null pointer, you can call it query exception, all of those are classes available. Okay, you can call it limit exception, or if you don't know what kind of exception can occur from here, you can always use the grandparent of the grandparent exception class. This will cover all your exceptions. I'll say system.debug and I'll say e.getMessage. Now here the message comes in picture, the method from the exception class. So now see what will happen. Anything that goes wrong here, the code will start executing line by line, something will fail here, okay, it failed here, it will immediately jump to the catch block. It will not continue, it will halt, go to the catch block, execute the catch block, that's it. But now you will not see an error in the screen. The customer will not see an error. Do you want to see how this looks like? Let's say deploy. Alright, now if I go ahead and execute the same code that we executed, I'll say execute last. See, last time I got an attempt to dereference a null object, right? I'll say execute last. See what happened? The log is a success log. However, if you take a look at the debug only statement, in line 21, you're getting a debug statement as part of the catch that something has gone wrong and the error that you're trying to receive is attempt to dereference a null object. So something went wrong, but see, the customer was not notified. The log is success. So you can handle it behind the scenes. That's the power of try catch block. Makes sense? If you want to see more, what do? You use the other method, that is basically get cause. Okay, and then you can also say get line number, right? Let's get these three information and let's say deploy. So you'll get to know what is the actual cause, what is the message, and which line number is causing the problem. All right, if I go ahead and say execute last again, the log will be a success, but I should see that the catch block is executed. And if I call the debug only log, see, attempt to dereference a null object, the cause is null and the line number is 10. So what is line number 10? Line number 10 is, see, this particular line. So it tried to access my account list.size, failed here, it did not even continue, it directly jumped here and gave you the error. That's it. Okay, now how do you know that where did it start from, which method was called? So you can get the stack trace information, e.get stack trace string, and now this will be helpful. Let's remove the cause from here because it's empty. Let's see these three things. Okay, I'll put some delimiter so that you are able to read it properly. All right, and let's put it here. Let's remove the plus sign from here, extra one, and let's say deploy. Okay, so now you should be seeing the line number that's causing the error, what is the message that's coming, and what is the stack trace, meaning how did it originate, from what source. Now if I say execute it again, the success log will show up, but something has gone wrong inside. We can take a look at the debug only statement. See, it says attempt to dereference a null object from line number 10, and it tells you line number 10 column 1 from exceptional exception class, and this is the method. See, this is a very helpful identifier to directly jump here and see, okay, what is going wrong here, and you can actually fix it. Oh, okay, I was trying to access a null keyword value, so I should put a check here, or something I need to do. I need to rectify, refactor, or modify it, and that will save you your exception. Okay, now what can you really do here? Okay, let's talk about what can you do here later, or let's talk about now, no problem. See, when you're on a catch block, so you know that an exception has occurred, correct? Now if an exception has occurred, you can actually log it somewhere so someone can be notified, correct? You can actually log it somewhere, meaning you can create a object. Normally the practice is that you create an exception log object in Salesforce or a logger object, and you dump this information there for every failure. That way, tomorrow if business says, hey, I was trying to do this and this did not happen, you can always refer the log object and see, okay, at this particular time, this error came, which is why this particular thing failed, and then you can work on fixing it. Make sense? What else you can do? You can actually notify org owner or any specific queue whenever a catch block is executed. So you can write that code here, correct? So these kind of things you can do here. All right, And this is true for any and every kind of exception that you're trying to handle or tackle. Correct? It's not just about printing system.debug. No one is going to see the logs, right? The logs will be gone after some time, but it is important that you log it somewhere for anyone to refer later. Okay. So now that you know the error is here, you can actually fix it. That's the whole idea. But what kind of exception did you receive? Null pointer exception. Null pointer exception, right? So I can also do something like I can specifically catch a null pointer exception. So if I change from exception to null pointer, I'll still be able to catch it because I'm catching a specific type of exception. But if your code runs and triggers any different exception, let's say a query exception, let's say this query fails the way it failed previously, correct? When I put a different name, it will fail with a query exception, but that will not be caught because you are only catching something specific. So you are saying that I'll catch a basketball, I'll not catch a baseball, yeah, or maybe a football. So you are only determined to catch a certain specific thing. So when something else comes, you will not catch it. You'll basically miss it. So that's the idea. Any other exception will be missed. Only null pointer exceptions will be caught as part of this. I just want to tell you this so that you know, okay, this is also a class. However, it's always safe to actually use the parent exception. What's wrong, right? Then it will catch all kind of exceptions. If I show you execute last, see, it still executes success. And if I take a look at the debug only, it still catches the exception, right? But what if see, line number 10 is failing, correct? Line number 10 is failing right now with a null pointer exception. But before line number 10, if line number 6 fails with a query exception, let's see what happens. Does the code fail or is it able to handle it? Let's see. Okay, if I go here and if I say execute and I'll just say execute, see, it has not been able to handle and the customer is now receiving an error. Why? Because it's a query exception. If I open this particular log, it is not a success log, it is a failure log and it is saying query exception has come. See, system.queryException. And why did it throw it on the screen? Because you did not handle it. You were handling the null pointer exception. So to be able to handle query exception, you need to choose query exception here. Make sense? Now if I deploy, it will be caught. Now this will be caught. Execute. See, now there has not come. It's a success log, but it will be written on the catch block that it has happened in line number 6 and it is a list has no rows assignment error. Awesome. Right? Now you might have a question. So Himanshu, what do I do if I have to track, null pointers and query exception? Because limit can also come, query can also come. So yes, that's why you have multiple catch blocks. So you can write multiple catch blocks. So you want to handle null pointer, go ahead and handle it here. So now both kind of exceptions can be managed. If the code fails because of query exception, it goes to this block. If it fails because of null pointer, it goes to this block. If some other exception comes, it will throw it on the screen. Because why? Correct, you did not catch it. Right? I hope you're getting the hang. Awesome. Let's deploy this. And I'm taking my time with this scenario so that you are pretty much clear of, what this code structure really means and how to actually play with it and mess with it so that the code does not mess with you, you mess with the code. All right. So let's try to execute this now. And this time, see, the error, the log is saying it is a success. And if you see the debug only statement, line number 6 is the problem. However, if I switch this and if I allow line number 6 to execute properly, line number 10 will be a problem and that will be part of the null pointer exception catch block. Okay, let's execute this again. Execute. Now instead of line number 6, you see line number 10 from 24. What is 24? 24 is this one right here. Correct? Right? But it's always better, it's always safe to actually, instead of having multiple catch blocks, you might be super sure, right? But then it's always better to use the parent class so that all exceptions can be covered. When will this other framework come into help? If you want to deal with a query exception differently, like you want to do 1 and 2, right? And for a null pointer exception, you want to do 3 and 4, meaning you want to execute different things based on the kind of exception you've received. In that case, it makes sense to have different catch blocks, correct? Or else you can always have just one catch block, and that is basically on the parent exception class. All right, this should be fine. Now, if you noticed, a try catch block is executing perfectly fine without someone, which is basically the finally block, and that finally block comes in here. So similar to the try block, the finally block is also curly braced. Only the catch block accepts a parameter which is of type exception. Okay, if I were to get rid of the catch block and the finally block, say save, and I try to deploy, see, compilation will fail. It says try block must have at least one catch block or a finally block. That's the whole idea. Okay, that was the thing that we were discussing. Now in finally block, what can you do? You can actually I'll just show you that finally block executes every time. I am here to execute myself, whatever happens. Correct. So even if the try block runs successfully, finally will execute. Even if it does not run successfully, it will go to the catch block, and when it reaches the catch block, does its thing, it will still execute the finally block. So the finally block is something that executes irrespective of whether exception has come or it has not come. Okay, that's the whole idea. Let's try to deploy it once and let's see if it gets deployed first of all. Yes, gotten deployed. Now if I say execute last, and if I take a look at the debug only statement, so you see whatever happened on line number 6 or line number 10 does not matter. Finally block should execute, right? Let me close this and let's say debug only. I am here to execute myself, whatever happens. See, line number 9 failed. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll get rid of line number 9. I'll get rid of line number 13. I'll get rid of line number 17. Let's say save. Now let's say deploy. Let's see if any error shows up or not now. Okay, let's say if the catch block is executing or not. Deployed. Let's say execute last. Now this time it is again a success, and if I take a look at the debug only statement, see, the catch block did not exist. This is just a debug print that we did on line number 6. We can get rid of it. It did not fail, but you are actually seeing that the finally block got executed even if the catch block did not run, right? So that's the whole idea. Whether the try block runs completely successfully or the catch block runs because of an error that is handled, either scenarios, if the finally block is mentioned, it is going to execute irrespective. It is kind of adamant that I will execute whatever you do. So what kind of things can you do here? You can actually do any kind of cleanup, any kind of archive, any kind of post code notification, any kind of additional handling that should happen irrespective of what is the outcome, meaning whether it is an error or a success, something should happen after this method is called. Maybe you want to call a third-party system and notify that we have executed this method. That should happen. So finally should run in all of those scenarios, and these are probably scenarios that wherein you would need a finally clause. Okay, so that's the whole construct of try catch finally block, and based on what I explained using the null pointer exception only till now, I hope you are able to make sense out of it. If you do, you know what to do. You need to write exceptions make sense. All right, don't write try catch finally, let's write exceptions make sense, because exceptions make sense. All right, cool. So that was about the try catch block, that was about the null pointer exception, that was about the parent exception. We also looked at the query exception. Right now the only thing that's pending that I want to talk about are the other type of exceptions. Right, so let's say you are trying to use a field which has not been queried. In that case you'll get an SObject exception. Okay, what does that mean? If I were here, let's close all the logs, let's go to VS Code. Right, so if you were trying to access something, let's get rid of all of this code. Okay, I'll just get rid of everything, and now I want to say id comma name from account where name equal to Salesforce makes sense. Okay, perfect. Now I want to say debug, and I want to, okay, let's not use debug. Debug is so simple and so plain. I'll say if account info dot rating is equal to high, I want to do something. Correct, that's what I'm trying to do. So what will happen here? What do you think? Will the code execute fine? Let's see. Let's say deploy. Okay, now if I go ahead and say execute last, executes fine. If I take a look at the debug log, it says SObject row was retrieved via sockle without querying the requested field. Account.rating, line number 6, handle my first exception. Line number 6. What am I doing in line number 6? I am saying if account info dot rating equal to high. What is wrong here? Okay, I'm trying to access the rating variable, rating field. Have I queried it here? No, I have not. So that's why the error says you are trying to use a row without querying the requested field account.rating. See how perfect is this particular line. What else do you need to understand the debug? You don't need anything else, right? So it clearly says that you need to add the rating field here. Only then this particular thing will make sense. And which error did you get? You got a you got a SObject exception. This is an SObject exception. Okay, if I click on this and I get rid of the debug only and I see the entire log, you'll see that in this entire log you see system.SObjectException has come. So if I copy this SObjectException, I can actually tag it here. I can go ahead and say SObjectException, this one right here. Even that's a class. Makes sense? But because we were accessing and using the parent exception class, it is caught. All right. So a lot of times you'll see this error because we tend to use the fields, but we forget to query it in the query, right? So you always have to have a query, right? That's your SObject exception, this one. Perfect. The query exception we have already seen, right? If there's something wrong with the query written, it will fail and it will basically give you a query exception. Normally we do dynamic binding, right? We try to write a SOQL using a string query and then we say database.query, right? We kind of do that. Or else let's say you are trying to access something that does not exist and the query kind of fails. So query exception will come there, like we saw when we were trying to access account information where name equal to something that does not exist in the system, it was throwing a query exception. All right. What if your insert, update or delete failed? What happens then? If insert, update or delete fails, DmlException comes. And that is basically telling you that any kind of database operation you were trying to do did not work out as you expected it to be. So let's try to say account info, and I'll just go ahead and remove the ID keyword from here. And I'll say account info dot rating is equal to high. Okay, let's try to see what happens here. I'll say upsert account info save, and now I'll say deploy. Okay, what am I trying to do? I'm simply trying to update the rating value for this particular record, and I'm using the upsert command. So if it finds a record, it will update it. If it does not find a record, it will insert it. Okay, that's the whole idea. So if I go here and if I try to say execute last, I'll see the debug log. What happens in the debug log? Debug only. It's running. I am here to execute myself, so meaning it worked perfectly fine. Okay, let me try to do something like update. Okay, I'll just say update, or let's do this. I'll simply say account ACC is equal to new account. All right, and I'll just say name is equal to account to throw error. Okay, and what am I trying to do additionally? I'm trying to basically set the rating value. Let's get rid of the query for now, and this is what I'm trying to do now. Okay, let's try to deploy this and let's see what happens. So I'm trying to create a new instance variable. I've given it a name and I'm saying account. Okay, this should be account, not account info. The variable name is wrong, and I'll say deploy. Okay, this should deploy fine. Yes. Now let's go to Salesforce and let's say execute last and let's see what happens. Okay, log is successful. Let's take a look at the debug only statement. You'll see that you've gotten an error. Update failed. Missing argument ID not specified in an update call. Line number 7 is failing. Which is line number 7? Update account is line number 7. What's the issue here? I'm trying to update a record, but I've not told which record to update because no ID is mentioned here. Because see, you need an ID, you need the record ID of the record, right, to be able to update. If I say go ahead and give your flower bouquet to this person, if I don't tell you who to give it to, who will you give it to, right? You cannot always give it to the one person. Let's say you have to give it to the third person. What do you do? So I have to ensure that I tell you that you have to give the flower bouquet to the third person. When I don't say that, it's a exception. You'll not give it to the right person, and that will be an error. Right? So that's why this database operation is failing, and that's being caught. And when it is being caught, you're getting a DmlException. If I click on this and I remove the debug only check, you'll see that a DML state exception has come, system.DmlException. And what is the error? ID not specified in an update call. It is a very common error we get in our Apex code, and now you know that this is basically the reason where you have used an update command, but you did not really put the ID in your query or somewhere. All right. Awesome. Let's look at the next one, LimitException. Right? So if I try to do something like this, if I try to say for integer I is equal to 0, I less than 150, I plus plus, and I say account ACC equals new account, name is equal to test account plus I. So I want to create bulk records, meaning I want to create 150 records at once. I'll simply say insert ACC. Okay, save, and I'll say now deploy. The code looks fine, right? I'm trying to do a bulk insertion. Okay, let's go ahead and do it. And the code has moved to the org. I'll just go ahead and say execute last. Execution works fine. It is taking time because bulk insertion is happening, right? So now bulk insertion has happened, a log has been created, and if I take a look at the debug only statement, everything ran fine. Perfect. 150 records have been created in the system. Execute. See, all my records have been created. But now if I do something like this, 151, right? And if I say deploy, let's go back, and now let's try to say execute last. It's running, it's trying to execute. I'll just close this and I'll say open logs directly. So you see, it is giving a limit exception and it is saying too many DML statements, 151. So your exception handling has actually shown that, you know, you are trying to access or do something that's beyond the governor limits, and that's why your code has failed and you're getting a DML statement error. Make sense? All right. If I just say okay, if I open this particular log here, and if I go ahead and type limit, you see it says too many DML statements, which is basically beyond your governor limit of 150. You are trying to do 151 record insertions, right? And that too individually inside a for loop. So it's telling you it is a system.LimitException and it has failed. All right. And if you see, it is saying number of DML statement is close to limit and it is 151 out of 150, which is why it failed. All right, number of DML rows are 150, and this gives you a good information about what you were trying to do and what kind of CPU time, DML rows, DML statements were used or consumed. So the debug logs help you become a good debugger instead of a bugger. All right. Now my concern is, why did this log show up like this? Why was it not handled? See, because we got an error. It should have been handled by the exception log, right? So let me just add another block and see if LimitException class is there. Yeah, let me just try to print this. And now let's see if the exception is able to catch it or not. Let's say deploy. And I'll just remove the catch parent block and I'll just put it here. Okay. It should always be in a hierarchy. The smaller one should be first, the parent should be next. Let's say deploy again. Let's go back and let's say executing. Let's see. Running fine, and now it's giving an error, right? So it is giving an error. Let me just see where is this going in terms of the flow. If I say debug only, there's no debug only statement. And if I open this again and if I say too many DML statements, it's coming from line number 7. So it's not going in this catch blocks. All right. So we'll have to look at why is that. Okay. Catch limit exception in Apex. All right. So once see, it says that exceptions that cannot be caught are limit exceptions. So if any kind of governor limit has been exceeded, you cannot really catch it. So even if you have put a catch block here, it's not able to catch it because this is more like a runtime exception and it's a governor limit exception. Okay. You cannot really catch it. So if it is a limit exception, you cannot catch it and it will come as a unhandled exception, and there's nothing you can do about it. Okay, but what can you do about it in terms of, you know, being precautionary? You do not do things inside a for loop like this, right? You should always create a list variable, add all those instances in the list, and put an insert command outside. You can do insert account list, right? Those kind of things you can do to ensure bulkification is done, and it basically does not break your code in terms of limit exceptions, and you're able to bulkify your code. One more thing that you can do is you can actually look at the limits class, right? Limits class gives you information about how many DML rows, or how many callouts, or how many DML statements, or how many rows, and all of those limit related information it can give you. Okay, let me try to show you how does this work, right? So when I'm trying to, let's go back to the previous code that was throwing an error, right? And what can I do here is I can simply print and show you what's happening. So I'll say limits dot get DML statements. All right, now I want to actually see how many DML statements have been consumed here. That's the whole idea. If I try to say deploy is fine. So you are using the limits class and a method from it. Now if I go ahead and say execute last, so it executes fine, and it will still throw an error because it is unhandled, but you'll get an additional log available with you, and that log will basically give you some idea about a certain thing that I'm wanting to tell you. If I open the debug only statement, you see it started from 0, and this is basically your count, and it reached 150, and after that it failed. See, if I remove the debug only, after 150 it failed, right? So what can I do as precaution? What can I do is I can basically say if limits dot get DML statements, because we are trying to do a insert, so DML statement is the thing, is less than or equal to 150, only till then you continue, or else don't continue. See, I know this is not the right way to write code, this insert account, but wherever you are doing insertions, right, you can actually use the limits check, correct? Because just to ensure that bulkification should be there first of all, and even if it is bulkified, what if things go into recursion or somehow your limits are breached? You cannot handle it, right? Because it's unhandled exception. So you have to always put a check. So now this will run only until you reach 150. It will not go to 151, and then your code will run fine. All right. If I now try to save it, and if I say deploy, let's go ahead and say execute last. I think it's starting from 0, right? So if I start it from 0, it should be less than 150. It should not actually go, because it will it is running from 0 to 150. That's 151 records. So if I say deploy, so I only want to insert records if the limits.get DML statements is less than 150. Okay, I don't want to breach the limit. Now if I go ahead and say execute last, this time it should run fine. Okay, so it ran fine, the log is success, and those records have been created in the system, meaning you have been able to carefully handle an unhandled exception. Okay, so ensure that the catch block will not be able to handle governor limit exceptions. How do you have to handle it? By using the limits class. Make sense? If it does, just tell me limits make sense in the comments. All right, awesome. That was this particular class. Let's look at the next one. Mixed DML is something that shows up on mostly on test classes, and we'll try to see this when we do code coverage, but trying to attempt database operations on setup and non-setup objects. Now what are setup objects and what are non-setup? Setup objects are nothing but objects which are from Salesforce and which have metadata kind of configurations like user, profile, permission set, rule assignments, validation rule, or any kind of object that has something to do with the metadata information is basically a setup object. What is a non-setup object? Which actually contains data related information, account, contact, opportunity, lead, case, etc. Right? Now when you try to do a database related operation together for one setup object and one non-setup object, in that case you get a mixed DML exception. Why? Because when you're trying to say Salesforce to do something on the metadata, and you're also at the same time trying to say Salesforce to do something on the data, that creates a hodgepodge in the system, and that's why you get a mixed DML exception, because Salesforce is not able to figure out what do I do. Should I go and look at the metadata thing first? Should I do the data? But what if the metadata needs a data update? What if the data messes the metadata? So it basically says, please don't go ahead and do it. I'll throw the mixed DML exception. As simple as that. Right? So this use case is most commonly found in test classes when you try to, insert a contact and a user for, let's say, a community portal. That's where it will fail. When you try to insert a contact and a user in a single transaction, it will fail and it will give you a mixed DML exception. Okay. Wow, awesome. A lot of stuff covered, a lot of good things learned, a lot of good things explained, a lot of good things understood, and a lot of good things to take away from this particular session. And the key idea was to get you comfortable with exceptions. It's okay to get exceptions. It's okay to basically, have errors in the system. Always ensure that you don't repeat the errors. All right. That's the whole idea I would like to give you as part of this tutorial. Now just tell me exceptions make sense, error handling makes sense, try catch block makes sense, and you're able to understand this and you'll definitely leverage it. It's always a good practice to have try catch blocks in your code, because see, that saves you from any kind of customer facing errors. Right? And that's very important, because you don't want to have any kind of error showing to the customer that they don't understand, and that kind of damages the reputation of the thing that you've built, right? That's the whole idea. Now, I've explained 6 or 7 exception types. What I want to know from you is, from your experience, if you are someone who has actually worked on Salesforce, or if you have seen any other exception apart from this, tell me about it and tell me how did you handle it, and tell me when does it come. Okay, probably just let me know about that. All right, I think that's all from this particular tutorial, and that should cover errors and exceptions. I will see you in the next one. Bye.